We've been living in this moment, which is part of a larger movement, the Me Too movement, right, to end sexual violence and support the survivors for about a year now. What have we learned? I think that we've learned how to see patterns and systems where we used to only see individuals and single stories. It's a lesson that we can and need to apply to other areas. But first, I want to break down how we got this new skill. Those old victim-blaming lies, like they were asking for it. Well, maybe they shouldn't dress that way. Didn't they know better than to? Those old lies stopped working. And I think they stopped working because we humanized the victims. We saw them as full beings worthy of standing up for, because they are. And we got real with ourselves about the sad fact that these aren't isolated incidents. We're a society of violence, and sexual violence is far more common than we care to admit. And as the stories continued, we started asking questions like, what do we do when it's not just the bad ones that are at fault? What do we do when people who are in positions of power violate the humanity of others? How do we support victims rather than blame them? And what does accountability look like? And as the number of stories continued to grow, the pattern of sexual violence became more and more clear. The stories all too similar. And we were seeing people in the mainstream understanding and sharing that they too were victims of sexual violence. People we knew, whether personally or on screen, were sharing their stories. And it became harder to blame the victim because they weren't someone in a far-off headline in the news. They were someone that we knew or that we admired. And so across lines of difference, across gender and sexual orientation and religious difference, political affiliation, we were making space for those stories. We were having complex conversations about accountability and systemic change. Oftentimes, with sexual violence, the perpetrators go nameless. Well, Me Too's changed that. Right? We had to wrestle with this idea that people we thought we knew, people who entertained us or we voted for, there was part of them we didn't know. And we had to reckon with that truth. They also were single stories, a part of a bigger system. And as the light shone on that bigger system, some people said, oh, not all men. And it's true, not all men are perpetrators of sexual violence. But embedded in that not all men reaction is this idea that, oh, it's just a few bad apples. Yeah, in reality, we have some bad apples, but the barrel is rotten. In many ways, our society sanctions this behavior, and in some ways, it enables and encourages it. And some of the stories of violence, we learned that it was a dirty little well-known secret, but our culture was all too willing to turn a blind eye. And that's what I mean when I say the barrel is rotten. Our society sanctions, enables, encourages, and sometimes turns a blind eye to sexual violence. And so it's not surprising then that we would see this behavior from some men. Yes, they're bad apples, but they're a product of the barrel in which they're living. Their behavior is awful, but it's not unexplainable when we see it in the larger context of sexism. Me Too has reframed the public narrative around sexual violence away from this idea that it's just a few bad apples to seeing and wrestling with the larger system of sexism and sexual violence on a societal and systemic level. Now, we're trying to change the pattern, not just blame the victims and make excuses for the perpetrators. Me Too has forced us to see a different story, a more complex story. Part of that complexity has been the inclusion of race and class. Some people said the only reason that we're caring about the Me Too movement now is because a number of famous white women have shared their stories of sexual violence. After all, Tarana Burke, a black woman, started the Me Too campaign in 2006. Yet, we understand that this wave has brought new appreciation and recognition for Tarana Burke. She was invited to the Oscars, as was Ai-jen Poo of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and suddenly, we're not just talking about sexual violence for white women, we're looking at the issue through the lens of race and class. We're accepting the complexity and having more nuanced conversations about this issue than we ever have. And so it got me thinking, could we apply the lessons of Me Too to other areas? Like maybe we can use what we understand about one unfair system and help ourselves understand another type of unfair system. And so I started to think about, could we apply the lessons and the empathy and the analysis that we've learned from Me Too to race? And then I remembered, wait a minute, I did a study on this. In 2009, I actually asked a group of white college students their attitudes about sexism and racism. And what we found is that when they had an awareness of race, and they had feminist attitudes that included an understanding of race and class, and the fact that they also impacted women, which we called inclusive feminism, that they were more likely to be anti-racist. However, when they had feminist attitudes that did not include an understanding of race and class, they were not more likely to be actively anti-racist. So the conclusion that we drew was rather than seeing anti-racism and sexism as completely separate, inclusive feminism was like fertilizer, increasing the likelihood that people would be aware of race and be actively anti-racist. And so if research models real life, which we academics always hope is true, the framework is there. We can apply the lessons of Me Too if we want to. And that's why I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can take the fight, the fervor, the fed-up feelings that we feel about sexual violence as a result of Me Too, combined with the awareness of race and class that we have in this moment, and it can be like fertilizer, increasing our rate of growth and understanding and analysis that's called for in the movement for Black lives. The movement for Black lives is concerned with the humanity and dignity of Black people, but it also has a vision for the liberation of all oppressed people. There are a number of platforms, but one that's gotten a lot of attention is police violence. I believe that we can apply the lessons of Me Too to solving for police violence because they have some common traits. Both involve perpetrators that historically go unquestioned and victims that are consistently seen to blame. Police are said to protect and serve, yet in 2017 alone, police killed over 1,000 individuals in the United States. 25% of them were Black, and Black people only make up 13% of the population. In 2015, 30% of Black victims who were killed by police were unarmed, compared to 21% of white victims. And on average, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police. What these facts make clear is that a profession that many trust is causing harm. I want us to wrestle with these truths. We are a society of violence, and police violence disproportionately impacting Black people is far more common than we care to admit. What's missing in the conversation about police violence is the ability to see the humanity in the victims who are so quickly seen as aggressive and dangerous. This is the point where the empathy that we've learned from Me Too is most useful. To humanize the victims of police violence requires us to see them as full beings who are worthy of standing up for, because they are. And it requires us to get real with ourselves about the fact that these aren't isolated incidents, and have the courage to see the pattern in the single stories of police violence. The stories all too similar. And so yes, when it comes to police officers, we have some bad apples, and the barrel in which they're operating is rotten. Holding these two truths at the same time is what I believe is needed to move from blaming to change, because it's what changed the conversation about sexual violence. Well, they were asking for it. Maybe they shouldn't dress that way. Didn't they know better than to? Those victim-blaming lies can cease to be acceptable explanations. We need to start asking, what do we do when it's not just the bad ones that are at fault? What do we do when people who are in positions of power violate the humanity of others? How do we support victims rather than blame them? And what does accountability look like? Perhaps it's being a Black woman potentially targeted by both sexual violence and racialized police violence that makes me keenly aware of these connections and possibilities. What I'm asking of you today is this: don't wait for either of these forms of violence to hit close to home before you're willing to act. Apply the lessons of Me Too to the movement for Black lives. Reject victim blaming. Seek accountability rather than accept the status quo. Be willing to take a critical look at the barrel and not just the individual apples. And be brave enough to name the patterns created by the single stories. Be part of ending violence, period. Thank you.